I wanted to start to ask you, Jonas, as we were looking through the drawings today and walking through, you will note, if you've been to the show before, the chronological kind of turn of the exhibition throughout the space. And I've been thinking about your work a lot in the last couple of months. And the idea of the hand and drawing being really so fundamental to your practice, I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about drawing as thinking. For you, for a practice, I mean, does it form the basis of everything you do? Was it the first thing you did as an artist?
I think it was the first thing I did as a kid. As an artist, no, I was really into painting my senior year of college. And I asked my professor before going to grad school, like, what I should do. And he's like, well, you better start drawing. So before that, I hadn't really thought about drawing as a practice. So going into grad school, I went to grad school for painting and drawing. That was my MFA. So there was an emphasis on it. We had a whole class called drawing in grad school. And I started to learn about drawing, I guess, in grad school more, thinking about it as connected to painting. But never before was I thinking about that.
Did it radically change how you were thinking about making paintings the more you focused on these kind of groups of drawings that you started to make?
I think like after I worked for Laura Owens in 2003, I think that I thought about it to more specifically then, connecting it, because she had made all these studies in drawing and painting and used them as models. And I was like, that's a good idea. And I sort of adopted that idea. So I would say, 2003, 2004. So right when this show started. Yeah.
And I mean, is it different for you to make a drawing than to work on a painting? Is it more meditative? Is it less meditative?
It's easier.
It's easier? Okay.
I think it's more automatic and forgiving than the way I paint.
Yeah.
And I find it pretty therapeutic in general to draw. I draw a lot when I'm in therapy. Yeah, so I like it.
While you're in therapy?
Yeah.
Like in the session?
Yeah, well, I talk to my therapist on the phone now, so he can't see what I'm doing. So,
Oh, good. I wonder if we could talk about your line. If we look across the work, has your line evolved over the last 20 years? If you could think about how mark making has evolved in your work. I mean, we were looking earlier at the pots here of the plants. And there's such a beautiful sort of juxtaposition of the crayon kind of markings with the more ink line drawings, the hard and the soft. And I wonder if you could talk about the evolution of that as we look through the show.
Well, I think the first thing I noticed, or maybe everybody could notice, is that it's not as sure and a little bit more naive. And I think maybe it's a little bit crisper in the ones of the crate, but I think I always was really into the way that I could relate a pencil line to a painting line. And so I think like as I developed my practice, I got like more knowledge, I guess. So I couldn't be as naive. I said it before in this walkthrough, but I guess this is another good place to say it. I do think I was quite naive, and then I learned a lot about my own practice, and then it became more like declarative over time, I think. And then I was always into mark making, and the scale shift of making a small drawing and then making it much bigger. So I don't know. I didn't really answer your question, did I? Yeah.
No, it makes sense. I mean, as I look at it, obviously, there's far more, later work. I mean, work behind us has a more graphic kind of like presentation, and the earlier ones there's a little more kind of playfulness between the two different or three different types of even materials, because you
Right.
have
The first ones are crayons, yeah. Like the first drawings all the way to the left in the beginning are from when I first moved to LA. And I was like, wow, there's a lot of cool plants here compared to the East Coast. And I started collecting plants and sort of painting and drawing still lifes as a way to practice painting. Because when I left grad school, I was like, I want to keep getting better at painting. And I tried to paint the things that my heroes painted. So, still life, portraiture, landscape, interior, and then sort of those are the first things I gravitated to. And then crayons, I don't know, I just had a big box of crayons I brought with me. And I think there's like some pen in those ones too. Some of the scales of the plants. Yeah, totally.
Okay, so let's talk about this for a second. Who are you?
I mean Hockney and Picasso and a lot of modern masters like Matisse or Bonnard, or people that use like patterns and painted what surrounded them. And I like Van Gogh. He's pretty good. Alex Katz. More graphic kind of people who are painting from life, but they weren't like realists. They had their own, I think I gravitated to people who had their own language, and it wasn't sort of like a photorealist, because I could never really paint from life anyways.
Marston Hartley once said, you don't see a thing until you look away from it. And what I find so interesting is your use of photography and going through your studio, how many photographs are sitting there on the wall, on the things you've collected. If you could expand a little bit more about your kind of relationship to photography, which of course itself is very much a framed thing. It's not like life again. There's a kind of mediation.
Right. Well, I collect a lot of photos and I look at a lot of photos. I don't really, I guess I'm like a builder or like a planner. So I'm not really like a spontaneous painter. So I got to pick the right things to paint, the right images to paint. And so like a big part of my editing process is, picking photos or manipulating photos and, starting to make drawings from them. Most of the time, that's what I do. I have a bunch of drawings and decide which ones I want to make paintings into from the photos. Yeah. So it's like I take pictures, I find pictures, people send me pictures, I appropriate pictures. And then sometimes I combine a bunch of pictures into one to make like a new picture, or I find like the perfect photo to make a painting of. So it's some sort of hybrid combination of photo sources. Yeah.
Appropriated, found, given.
Yeah. I used to have like film and I would print it out, and then I had a digital camera and I'd print it out, and then I've just used an iPhone for the last like 10 years.
Yeah. I mean, photography, which I've Henry Fox Talbot called it the pencil of nature. So I always think about this relationship of light to the paper, and then the hand with the stylus or the piece of graphite or charcoal or crayon to the paper as being kind of an equivalence in a way that people don't normally think about it. So when I think about your drawings, I do think about photography, but not in that kind of way that, it is just from photography in a sense. Could we talk a little bit about flatness?
Sure.
So if you're not drawing from life, you're drawing life, as we were saying. And there's a kind of, they're figurative works. And yet, like someone like Raoul de Keyser or Arthur Dove, George O'Keeffe, various people, there is a sense in which the figurative and the supposedly abstract or form kind of blur those boundaries between the strictness of like figuration versus abstraction. I look at the work behind us here, these four works, and think of them as kind of your Mondrians in a way, or your Stuart Davis. There's this like, Broadway boogie woogie kind of, way in which if you like just blink for a second, you start to see these shapes, forms, and patterns, which of course are tennis courts.
Right. Well, not to harken back to grad school, I feel like a lot of people think about what people said to them in grad school. But I remember professors being like, your paintings are so flat and you're a figurative painter. And then I was like, I like it. I like the flat, bold colors. I think about it more as like stacking, almost like printmaking, where you could just stack a bunch of flat shapes on top of each other and you could create space. And that was sort of like a limitation that I liked. The particular thing about tennis courts, like I would turn off the lights in my studio and take pictures with my phone and just get this shape. I'd take pictures in my studio of anything or whatever I was doing. I was like, this looks like a cool painting idea. But I did think, that's funny that you mentioned Mondrian, because I do think about them as sort of just like a abstract color study. And I sort of continue to revisit it just as a way to practice. You know, I think most of the things I'm revisiting is just a way to practice how things are put together, you know. And flatness, I don't know, just I was always attracted to it.
No, it's
and I think like cutting things out, I made a lot of collages, and like even when we met in 2010, the plant, like sort of the super flat Calder,
black and gray one.
Yeah, the black and gray one or anything like that. I was intentionally trying to make my work as flat as possible and still sort of convey like that it was a plant or, you know, some sort of object, even though there was like zero space. I also think I make paintings of places where you could identify the place, or an object where something's just floating, and it's like an object painting, like a pot, or, you know, like a clipping of a plant, and I'm kind of fine with that too. Yeah. Somehow.
Yeah. I mean, if I think about Warhol and I think about the early silkscreen paintings, of course, they're incredibly graphic. They're found images. They're from the news or from publicity. And yet there's an insane flatness, both metaphorically and physically, in how he transferred those and used them and kind of messed with them and abstracted them in a sense. And I kind of feel like that happens in this drawing practice as you move towards in and out of focus, let's call it. It's like pulling focus in a film, in a sense. If we look at the work from the Hammer, or if you look at, oh God, where did it go? I think it's underneath over there. Or the crates, for example. I think of the crates, the milk crates, as this kind of incredible way of building abstraction into the, you know, from the real world, appropriating it, or abstract geometries. And it made me think of the other day when I was looking through your work about Ellsworth Kelly's photographs, which a few years ago, there was a show at Matthew Marks here of his photography, which I'd never seen, and it blew me away because all of his forms came from these photographs he took of barns and buildings and architecture. And so the window or the shadow and stuff, and this is where kind of many of these forms came from. And that also brought me to think about your work and the kind of architectonic quality of the way you build both with your collage elements physically. On some of these are, you can see on the back wall, the speaker back there with the plants on top, that's a collage, right? I mean, there's cutout elements.
Yeah, those are a bunch of like failed drawings that I glued together. There's like a pot of my wife's and like a speaker that I glued onto a piece of paper and put it together. I made a painting of it.
But there's a kind of way in which the kind of the architectonic shape, the architectural shape of these objects become, you know, you kind of pull back and forth between a speaker and something much more kind of abstracted in that,
right.
that
well,
Ellsworth Kelly sense.
Right. Well, I think like painting can be anything. It doesn't have to be totally real all the time. And so I think that kind of carries through all my work because none of it is really like how it really looks in real life. So I'm kind of cool with it.
And yet there's a lot of architecture in your work as well. And your grandfather?
My dad was an architect.
Oh, your dad was an architect. Okay,
yeah.
Sorry.
Yep.
Yeah.
And he was like a builder. It kind of makes sense because he was like a planner and organizer. It's kind of how I make stuff.
Yeah.
Similarly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You built it that way.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to come back to plants. Ian Altivere, who's a a colleague and friend who's at the Met but now going to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, wrote a really beautiful essay for your Fiden book where he talks about plants and modernism. And looking at the very earliest drawings, I mean, you, like many of the painters and photographers from the 20s, this kind of modernist artists, were looking at plants. And I'm wondering if you had a similar kind of like looking at them as this kind of abstraction from the world, or why you kind of gravitated. Was it that your wife was making pots meant to be planted? How did that kind of evolve?
I think I just generally was into plants, but then I think I like the patterning and the repetition and the symmetry and the geometry and I don't know, the varieties and how much they have to offer to me, like to think about what I could paint and what I could draw, and then just living with them, like growing lots of orchids or growing lots of plants and seeing them change. I think like just LA was so different than the plants that grew in the East Coast too. So I felt like it was like prehistoric, the type of stuff that you'd see in succulents. And I mean, we had like some stuff growing in our house, but the amount of stuff that just grows on the side of the road in LA, that's like fascinating compared to what you'd find on the East Coast. I was sort of into that. And I was just searching for things to paint, and just gravitated towards it.
Very Californian, I have to say. And very Californian in terms of like the architectural in, out, the natural world and the built environment kind of, and how you incorporate that in your work. And I was looking at these the other day and thinking about Carl Blossfeld's botanical photographs from the teens and 20s, and that kind of history of modernism, which was why I was kind of asking about it. Another thing I'd like to talk about a little bit is like, and you've touched on it, but this kind of, again, the works are figurative, but there is this kind of, the French word, mise en abîme, the two mirrors together, which make a progression. If you look at many of the works, they're drawings. They're drawings of a show of your paintings, which are maybe based on a drawing, which are maybe taken from a photograph. So there's all these layers in the way in which you're kind of working in terms of that, the image.
That came from like the studio and making models and looking at your work in a model for a show, like the one from the Hammer show, that's like about to the left of the wrestlers, to my left. So that's from a show I did at the Hammer in like 2010, and that was I just took pictures of the model.
That was the maquette. Yeah. Okay.
And then I was like, and then the one to the left of that is from an art fair, and then I just started making series of works that were based on my work hanging somewhere, just based on that. Yeah.
No, I mean, I find it really liberating and interesting.
Cool. Well, I think it's interesting to see. I really like the 3D model, like to move things around, like in a dollhouse. I don't love the 3D rendering that they got going on these days, even though it's great. It's very helpful, I guess, but I like to be able to like manually move it around, and then I would stick my camera inside the model and take a picture. And I thought it was interesting, something to paint.
Yeah. I mean, I prefer a model. I can't manipulate the 3D modeling for exhibition design, and two, I much prefer it to play at the Playhouse. So aspect of it, I did a whole Warhol show for Musea Humex, and the model stayed in our house forever because then my daughter started playing with it. So
right.
With her animals. But the idea that, physically you can kind of in this smaller scale.
Yeah. I got some friends who do it with like magnetic walls, and then they magnetize the paintings and they can move them around. I like the putty and the sticking and the moving.
Can we talk about altered states? I read somewhere that
Sure.
you once did it. I don't know if you were a student, but you spent all night
doing cocaine.
Yeah, and making a drawing and
of Larry Bird. Yeah.
Of Larry Bird, and
that was great. That was probably like 2004 or 5.
Okay. So that's early.
Yeah. Pre-kids, because daddies don't do coke, according to my wife. Well, I enjoy a good altered state in the studio.
It's not about calling you out on studio practice or whatever.
No.
But I'm thinking about altered states and also how, more metaphorically, how this kind of comes out in your work. I look at the picture. I can't remember what it's called over there, with the shelf and the skull, which I think about Hans Holbein's Ambassadors. With the anamorphic skull. With the still life by Holbein. And I think about this one, and there's something really trippy about this one. Of course, the memento mori of the skull, but all the objects from your life. And
my daughter asked me about the skull. She's like, why is there a skull in there? I was like, that's how you practice, looking at a skull. So I had like a plaster skull. I probably stole it from grad school. And that was all the shit on my shelf. And the Gustin, I mean, that just came from taking pictures too, because I would just take pictures of setups and try to think of how I could work on a still life. I actually revisited that still life like 10 years later and made a couple paintings from it. And I painted it like it was, and then I put different stuff in the same kind of shelf setup. But yeah, it was just the stuff in my studio and very traditional kind of like painting practice. Yeah. That one's cool. That one has like collage and charcoal and colored pencil, and
I love
that was the studio I did the cocaine in.
The upper right hand corner, I love the lines and the colored lines that go kind of horizontally across the work. There's something really.
Those were magazines.
Those are magazines.
Yeah.
And then the work next to it with the plant and the tape column.
Mm-hmm.
I keep calling that in my head your Brancusi endless column. You've got your duct tape column with your architectural kind of plant kind of thing going on.
Right.
But all of the objects from your production and your life kind of keep coming back in this kind of abstracted way in the work.
I love some stacked tape. It's a good still life element. But that one also has some collage in it, like a bunch of paper and different things glued together. That's actually that one hangs in my office, and so I get to see it all the time. Yeah. Yeah, and I was always into the idea of like the way that you were looking at it was more like how you looked into something sometimes and not straight on. So I was always trying to tilt the like ellipses of the perspective of the top of the vessels and stuff like that.
And just moving down the row here. I mean, I look at the, early on when we met, I mean, you were known for these basketball drawings. And then I was starting to look at the Greek vases and just thinking, there's really similar. I mean, the Spalding basketball and the Greek vase. And I wonder if you could talk about those two forms that you chose to paint.
Right. Well, it was just out of my practice. Like I started making a lot of portraits from sports portraits because I didn't want to paint my friends anymore. So I was like, I'll just paint something else I like. And there was a lot of like floating basketballs in the air when somebody shot it. And I was like, that's cool looking. Those are probably like the first kind of like painting or drawing I made that was like just one object. And then the Greek pots came out of showing in New York. Me and my wife, in 2007, I started showing with Anton Kern. And my wife was like, let's go to the museum and look at not paintings, which I usually would just look at paintings. So we would look at different stuff in the Met. And I was like, this looks pretty cool. And I would start drawing the stuff there and bring them back to my studio after I drew them in New York. And I sort of got into, like, I'm just into like seriality or kind of delving into something I was interested in. And those were sort of object paintings too, where there weren't really in a place or anything. And I liked the story. And it's sort of kind of the first time I was like, okay, people put shit on pots. Like my wife put stuff on pots, like Magdalena Frimkes put stuff on pots. And so that, I think that was sort of the beginning of the idea of you can kind of put anything on a vessel. And they were, we were just in Greece and we were looking at these like little teeny ones at the Banakti Museum that were really beautiful. I took a bunch of pictures and I made some drawings of them still like 20 years later. So just like, I don't know, just natural. It wasn't really like thought out. It was just, my wife's like, we should look at something besides paintings. I was like, that's probably a good idea.
It's a healthy thing.
Right. But the floating basketball, I think I made like 100 of them in my studio just like that. And I like pinned them up all on the wall. And then I ended up making like giant paintings of my studio with the balls pinned up on the wall. And they were sort of like, I don't know. The whole idea about like the shit that I paint came from just advice that like professors gave me in school. Like, you should paint what you're into. You know, I like sports. So I painted sports shit and stuff that I was looking at, you know.
There was not a Coons reference there.
I mean, no. I mean, but I had seen Coons, but I wasn't like trying to
You weren't
channel
thinking, no.
Coons or anything. No, it was totally selfish. I didn't really care about what he did. I like Coons.
No, fair enough. But
Yeah.
I was sort of joking. I mean, you know, Ann Temkin, chief curator of MoMA, once wrote years ago about Robert Gober's drawings in terms of the campaigns of drawings he made. Drawings of sinks, a whole group, and drawings of the cribs that he did. Of course, as a sculptor, it was always a standalone but also important practice for Bob. And I think about your work in the same way. And there's different campaigns that you've kind of organically developed, whether it's the plants.
Keep going back to the well. I keep going back to the well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, not to be redundant, but I was just like, I just want to keep practicing painting.
Yeah.
And I keep going back to the same things and kind of I trying to reinvent them or not so much.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Is there anything new? I mean, have you? What,
I just made a golf ball.
You made a what?
I just made a golf
Titleist.
ball.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that the last drawing in the show? I mean, most
yeah,
recent?
the bonsais. I started making some bonsais because Brendan started sending me some bonsai books. And so Brendan influenced me on that one.
Okay.
Those are new, kind of new. But, I mean, if I painted like a new portrait of somebody, I feel like that would be new.
Yeah.
Even if it was somebody I already painted.
No, that's great. I mean, one of the biggest questions or thoughts I've had about thinking about your work is, you know, whether you can paint an autobiography. Sorry, thank you. Do you look at yourself as painting your life in that sense?
Yeah, because I'm painting whatever's around me. I think it's different. If I'm gonna paint like a portrait of my mom or my daughter or my wife, I definitely feel like it might be charged slightly differently. And also I might feel like a little more beholden to try to make it look like them. But it doesn't usually happen. But yeah, I mean, I think that's the kind of artist that I am. I paint my life, you know, the stuff that's around me that I'm like titillated by, you know, and if it's just like a room with some plants in it or, you know, a baseball player or a friend, you know, or like another artist, because I incorporate a lot of other people's art in my art, it seems like.
Magdalena Suarez from Kiss. And
yeah, a lot of Frimkiss action. And my wife,
Mark
of course.
Rochane's there and
Yeah, shirtless Grochon.
Shirtless
Yeah.
Grochon, yes.
I made a shirtless painting of my friend Susumu one time too.
Say it again?
I made a shirtless painting of this guy one time too. Like 20 years ago.
Not on view right now.
Yeah,
Okay.
not on view right now. It's in my personal collection.
Yeah, I mean, because, yeah, when I look at your work and I think about the drawings and the daily, do you draw daily? Is it a daily practice or is it a weekly practice? Do you go
If I'm in the studio, yeah.
What's that?
If I'm in the studio, yeah.
Okay.
Like I bring stuff with me, like emergency, you know, like if I'm losing my mind, then I need to relax a little bit. But not a daily practice unless I'm in the studio. But if I'm in the studio, yes, it is. Yeah.
Do you get any inspiration from film, for example? Do you see things, moving image work? Is there a filmmaker or a way that someone shoots film that has made you look differently at the way you kind of work?
Not consciously. Not consciously. But I love movies.
That's That's
Yeah.
fine. And then, I mean, the whole sports thing came out of your love of sports.
Yeah. Totally.
You're a big Larry Bird fan, being from
Big Boston Celtics fan. Yep. Larry Bird fan.
Yeah.
But I mean, I like the setup of the sports card because of not just the graphics, the colors, the boldness, the kind of format, you know, patterning, all the stuff that I like about painting is in it. You know,
The ready-made portraits
I like the.
too, right?
I really like the. I don't think there's any. Maybe the Larry Bird portrait, but I was really into like the backgrounds of sports photos because a lot of times the athlete would be in focus and the background would not be in focus, so you could kind of abstract the background. I think that's interesting to me.
Yeah.
But nothing more than just trying to like lean into what I'm interested in and take pictures of what I'm interested in and find things that I'm interested in. Because like the worst thing that can happen is if you make something that you're like not into. And I think that happened a lot when I was in grad school, where you'd get halfway through something, you'd be like, I fucking hate this, you know? And I didn't like that feeling.
Does every drawing end up on canvas somehow?
It used to when I was younger, but it was more like an obsessive compulsive kind of thing where I had to have like a perfect drawing that I used as a study.
Yeah.
And it happened like the two drawings that are up high right there, the first fort of the kids playing on the fort and the green backyard, those are made in like right after I stopped working for Laura Owens. And I really, from there, I pretty much, for probably like 10 years, I had to have a study that I made a painting from and use as a model. And then it became almost like restricted at some point, maybe like 10 years ago. And I started making a bunch of paintings just from the photo sources so that I could kind of liberate myself and kind of draw within painting. And then, you know, so it's probably about 50% of the time, 60% of the time. But almost everything in the show became a painting or some sort of painting, you know, some version of it. And I still always have some sort of drawing model. And a lot of things I do now, if I don't have a drawing that I'm using as a model, if I underpaint a painting, a lot of times I take a picture of it and I can draw, like print it out and draw on top of my underpainting to try to figure out, you know, the course of action.
Being married to an artist who makes objects,
Mm-hmm.
has that radically changed how your painting practice? Because I know your studios are together, and when I go visit you, I see both of you, and
Right.
you know, I'm very
Well,
curious.
I've
about,
still yet to make anything besides a 2D object so far in my life, basically. But well, like I was saying earlier, when I first started getting into making still lifes out of grad school, I was like, oh, my wife makes vessels, and I just started using them. But even getting into like Frimkis pots or getting into these things that I call like landscape pots, there's a bunch of them over here. That's when I started putting things in like hypothetical vessels, you know, and even putting like Matisse paintings in hypothetical vessels. So I never actually made vessels, but I think I really got into the idea that you could put anything in it. And then when we started collecting like the Frimkises like a decade ago, I think that kind of led into making like Matisse pot paintings and making some more kind of like radical decisions about what you'd put in a vessel. You know, I tried like a long time ago in 2008 or 9. There's like a half finished Kevin McHale like landscape pot thing over there. That was just like 2 failed drawings, and I cut the unfinished Kevin McHale drawing into a shape of a pot, and I cut out a failed Monstera plant, and I put them together, and I made a little painting of it. And I actually made another one at the same time from a failed golf course that I put a plant in, and I made a painting of that. And I didn't really revisit that idea until like 9 or 10 years later, until like maybe 2014 or 15, when I sort of got back into that concept. I like pulled it out and I was like, this is a cool idea, because that's pretty much what I just recycle, you know, recycle my
but
ideas.
you keep an archive. I mean, this is
Yeah.
from your archive, for example.
Yeah, this is
are
from
all
my
yours,
archive.
right?
Yeah, these are all
Yeah.
my drawings.
Yeah.
Or not all my drawings, but the ones that we selected for this.
Yes. Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. that I think we'll open up for questions in just one sec. I mean, I don't know if this is a question or a comment, but when I was looking at your work 2 weeks ago, I had been reading Joan Didion again, the White Album, and thinking about California and thinking about your work. And the opening essay, she talks about, we tell ourselves stories in order to live. And that's why when I read a long time ago that you're not painting from life, you're painting life in a sense. This practice, that's why I earlier was talking about autobiography, because it really feels like your life. But at the same time, the framing of it, the excerpts you're taking, the Lakers floor, the tennis courts, from that kind of more abstracted thing to the sports that you were looking at, to your own exhibitions, to your family. It's kind of this, cosmos of a personal life right in front of you in this four walls, in a sense.
I kind of know what you're going to, I can respond to that.
Okay.
I think about this stuff kind of as like new memories, even though they're old memories. Yeah. And sometimes I keep pictures for years before I paint them. It's not like I take a picture and automatically paint it. Sometimes I do. Sometimes I find an old family photo or like a picture I took of my wife a long time ago, or some landscape that I took a picture of a long time ago, and like create something new out of something old. It always feels like it's not a new idea, it's an old idea, but I'm kind of creating a new energy about it, a new reality, something like that.
I think that's a really beautiful place to wrap it up. If you're willing to answer a couple of questions.
Yeah, let's answer some questions.
If there's any questions from the audience. And should we get a microphone to people? Should I? No? We're good. You can just ask. Sorry.
Yes.
I look through it, the color seems to get more sort of deliberate. What is your thinking about color when you go into painting?
Well, I like color a lot. And I think, I don't know, I've always just been into putting colors together and how they work, I don't think it's a super conscious decision or anything, but I've always sort of been drawn to bold colors and bold shapes and how they can work together, color theory or whatever, I guess, something like that. I don't know if that answers your question. It doesn't feel like I don't go into the studio being like, today is like a pink day or something like that. It's usually I'm responding to some images that I picked out, and it always gets heightened somehow because I'm not using like all the local color that I'm looking at from whatever image I'm choosing to paint from. So I don't know, intuitive.
There another one? Yes.
Let's do it. Okay. I'll do my best. Oh, let's do it one at a time. I'm not going to be able to remember. I like green a lot, and that's a good color. Yeah, I usually, I make a lot of lists. I'm kind of like regimented about I paint. Like I'm going to paint these leaves today, and then I'm going to paint this grass over here, and then I'm going to paint this roof. And then when the list is done and I don't have any more notes, when I make a painting, I put a lot of notes around it because I sort of paint in sections, and I sort of draw in sections the same way. So it's like I'll leave notes and then I'll go back through my notes, and then when the notes are done, and then usually I'll ask my wife, does this look horrible or does it look okay? And she's like, I can't believe all the crazy shit you say about your paintings. So usually something like that, if I'm unsure. I don't get a lot of paint on the floor.
Pretty neat. Your studio is pretty clean.
Yeah, I'm pretty clean, but I don't know. Probably like a gray tone, like a neutral tone. I listen to like a lot of hip hop and reggae and a lot of podcasts, you know, like a lot of sports podcasts and like poker podcasts and like some other bullshit.
What's your favorite sports podcast?
I listen to like 7 different NBA podcasts, mostly on the Ringer podcast network.
Yeah, Bill Simmons.
Bill Simmons, big Bill Simmons
Well,
fan.
he's a Boston guy. Come on.
Yeah. You're welcome.
Is there another one? Question? Oh, yeah, sorry. Please.
Yeah. Totally. So I worked for Laura for almost 2 years, from like 2003 and a half or almost 4 to the end of 2005. I was the only person working in her studio besides her husband at the time who worked for her. And I didn't know who she was when I moved to LA. I'd never read an art form before I moved to LA. And I got this job through a friend, Matt Johnson, who I was working for before that. And after I worked for her, and she taught some grad school at, I'm giving you a super long-winded answer. She taught grad school at UCLA at the time, and she called Matt up and said, do you want to be my assistant? And he said, no, but my friend just moved, who's a painter. And so I just got this random job. And she was working, when I first got there, she was working on a painting for her first Whitney biennial. And the type of stuff I did for her was stretch canvases, underpaint canvases, mix oil paint, random fetching of things. But mixing oil paint was like the most fun. Probably I learned how to do that the most there. Underpainting, and that's just the stuff that I did. But the stuff that I absorbed was, infinite. It was probably just as valuable. Both me and my wife got excellent, amazing jobs out of grad school. She worked for Charlie Ray for almost 4 years, and then I worked for Matt, and I worked for her. So just seeing how like a professional artist organized their studio, how she organized her thoughts. And what I picked up was that she had these tremendous amount of drawing and sort of like mini versions of her paintings where she was like testing everything out over and over again. And she also used a projector. So when we were in grad school, you were not supposed to use a projector. According to art professors, it was very bad. You weren't supposed to have anybody to work with you. You weren't supposed to have any assistants. You're supposed to do it all yourself, and you weren't supposed to use a projector. So those two things right there were kind of new to me, because she would make something very small and then able to make it very big, but still able to hold on to all the sort of nuances of a very small line bigger. And it's like how she did that was through projecting, through practicing, and then making her paintings was very theatrical. She would practice and she would practice, and she would get on the big stage of making a painting, and then she would have to enact all these things that she learned from the smaller things in the bigger thing. And if it failed, she would try to do it again. So the biggest thing I took, which I mentioned earlier, is the idea of like making a study and painting from a work on paper. And I'd never done that before until I worked for her. And, seeing somebody have a model in their studio of a show, how she interacted with her art dealers, how she interacted with collectors, and just the way that she thought about it, the way that she studied, all the books that she looked at. The way that, she's a genius. So I just got to, a window into that for a short period of time. And after I worked for her, her studio expanded like drastically. Over the years, she had a couple people. I think she employs like 20 people or so now. She has a whole army, of people making these in-house wallpaper, and people who work on the computer, and people who help silkscreen the paintings and everything like that. So I got a really intimate and like amazing, tutorial, and I always credit her a lot for that. Yeah.
I have a quick follow-up.
Sure.
I read that you worked at one point in a neural imaging lab.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Well, I studied psychology in college, and my friend's dad was like a head of the Harvard psych program, and in between my junior and senior year, I got a job at McLean Hospital, working at the fMRI lab, which is like a functional MRI lab where they put you in MRI and then they like give you a test and do different shit and take pictures of your brain while you're doing stuff. And I gave like intelligence tests. So I was into like lab psych where you'd like put stats together and you write papers and stuff like that. So I did a couple things. I did intelligence testing to like, they mostly did things with like schizophrenia and drug addicts. So I administered those, and I did some stuff on the computer where you like cut out each slice of the brain, because they would take all the pictures and you'd have to cut out everything that wasn't brain, like skull, you know, and then they would like stack all the images together and make these three-dimensional brains. So I did that between my junior and senior year. And then after my senior, like I finished my major after 3 years, and then I started studying painting my senior year of college. So I didn't want to do any more psychology in college because I was like, this is enough psychology. And then I got a job out of college working at the same place. They paid me like $40,000 or $50,000 a year. And they were like, you should go to grad school for this. And I was like, I think I'm going to study painting. So I had that job for a year at McLean Hospital, at the lab at McLean Hospital for like a year. So that's it. Yeah, that was my psych experience. Yeah. I studied like child development, and I'm dyslexic, so I did a lot of independent studies about dyslexia, and I actually wrote a paper when I was in grad school about how to be a successful artist somehow my senior year, or how to have a successful studio practice, what I thought. And one of them was smoking weed, and I was like, I think you need to be slightly fucked up, you know. So yeah, so I thought I was going to be a doctor. Like I'm from like a family of doctors, and but I swerved on that.
It worked out, I think. Okay.
Yeah, it worked out all right.
I think it's fine.
Yeah.
Is there another question? One more.
I mean, the idea of this show and working with Karma was like I wanted to do a drawing show, so I didn't want to borrow anything. So this isn't like a drawing survey of like everything I've done. This is what was in my flat files. And so no, I didn't really think about it like that. But if I did do a drawing survey, I would definitely want to hunt down, you know, a bunch of drawings, because probably made like 10 times more drawings like this. You're welcome.
We have time for one more. Yeah, please.
Well, mostly it was probably about like I think about because you've been to my studio before, and you've been to a lot of people's studios. I think it's like more scientific than people think, or more like cooking. You know, like a cook than you would think. You know, you sort of have to limit what you're doing, and then kind of refine aspects of it. I mean, I guess I'm being kind of general, but I mean, you set up, I guess rituals is not the right word. You set up sort of like practices, and you tweak them, and you change the materials, or you change like how you're approaching it, you know. But I think about studio practice as like it's pretty scientific, you know. It's pretty you have to be quite organized. I think it's helpful, I mean, at least for me, to access the stuff I want to access. You know, being really organized is really helpful for me and my wife, and just even like how I like collate pictures, or how I, you know, even set up a canvas like to start with. The whole kind of processes, all the different processes that you go through. Is that a general answer? I don't know. I don't remember. I remember it was the paper was like very like bombastic and making a lot of, you know, claims that I had no idea were true or not, just based on reading about other artists, you know, how they set up their studio, you know, what they were investigating. I did like realize that people spent a lot of time. A lot of people said they spent, like, I read, you know, Guston's Night Studio, and he was never around because he was always working. So it seemed like a big part was spending a lot of time thinking about yourself and being, you know, self-absorbed.
On the self-absorption note, I will point out that the exhibition is going to travel, or we're not sure yet,
I think that's the plan. Yeah.
or is that not public? Sorry. Potentially, but see it here again.
I think we're gonna show this group of work in L.A. at the new Karmagallery in L.A. That's the plan.
Fantastic.
We can do a part 2.
And there'll be a book coming out that as soon as you get my essay.
Yeah, we made a book, and I did a conversation with Laura Owens in the book. We talked about some of this stuff.
I'm looking forward to reading your
And Douglas is writing it.
Yeah,
The most amazing essay ever written.
in the universe. Jonas, thank you. Brennan and Karma, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.